Hi everyone, and welcome to this Future Earth webinar on eye-catching science, creating free infographics and data visualizations. I'm just wondering if you can all hear me. I'd be very grateful if someone could say in the chat box whether you can hear and see me, so that we can make sure this is working. Thanks to everyone who's joined so far. We've got 30 people in the room that I can see, and we're expecting 160. So I'm sure more people will join as we carry on. So I think the video is now working. I hope that you can hear me. Once again, maybe if somebody could just type yes or no in the chat box, that would be fantastic so that we know it's working. Thanks, Charlotte, that's great. I'm going to hand you over to Jim now, who's going to be the host of today's webinar. Just to remind you, this is being recorded so that it can be broadcast on YouTube straight away, and the slides and the video will be available on our website afterwards. If you have any questions while the webinar is going on, please just put them in the chat box and I can put them to Jim straight away, and then we'll have a longer period for questions at the end. Thank you very much. Over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Lizzie. Hi, everybody. Welcome to part 2 in this webinar series. I'll just switch over to my presentation so we can begin. I'll skip my introduction this time. Let's have a look here. So just so that you all know, because I'm presenting in full screen, I can't actually see your questions and comments as you're going. So Lizzie will be acting as a moderator for those. So if there's anything that kind of looks like it needs interrupting me to answer, Lizzie's going to take care of that. Okay, so part 2. What did we do last time? Let's talk about part 1 first. So what I wanted to do with this was kind of take you in a linear fashion through how the process of kind of getting an infographic off the ground. And for some of you, I guess, parts of that might be more relevant. For example, if you're just trying to make a single chart, maybe this webinar would be more relevant than the previous one. So I was trying to aim it so that you could get a look through the whole process. What we talked about last time was establishing where this graphic fits into your communications strategy. We talked about establishing your audience as a priority, because that really helps you to structure your information correctly so that you can target it at those folks. We've established a medium, so how we're going to deliver this or how we're going to publish it, because that also gives you some requirements. We've established the key messages that we're going to deliver, so working back through those, the key messages that are going to work in the medium that we've chosen and for the audience that we've chosen. And then we went through quite an extensive list of some of the kind of free or freemium online tools that you can use to build your infographic or chart. I also mentioned last week, and I'll talk about it again towards the end of today's webinar, the importance of researching how other people have solved their particular communications problems. I think that's really key, especially if you're not totally familiar with design, because it can really give you some great inspiration for some color choices and how to use your space effectively, which we'll also talk about today. In case you missed last week's, that's a link to it. There's a link there to all of the Future Earth pop-up webinars.
Hi, Jim. Sorry to
Hi.
interrupt you. We don't seem to be able to see your slides yet. Could you have another go at starting them, please?
Oh, yes.
We heard loud and clear, but the slides don't seem to have started playing.
Oh, that's my fault. Here we go. Let's do this. How about now?
Can see them now. It's coming up. That's great.
All right, we'll just go through that because I talked about all that already. So here's a link to the previous ones. Before I start talking about this, I'll actually just give you a quick overview of the things we'll talk about today. So what I'm going to do initially is really get practical. So we've gone through all of the kind of thinking behind our infographic, and we're kind of arrived at the point now where we're actually building it and chosen your tool. So what I'm going to do today is share with you a few tips that I've kind of collected. I mean, I can't give you a full design course in the hour that we have, but what I'm hoping to do is just kind of give you a few tips for some things that I've seen that are common things that people do, and some ways to step around them. And I'll be borrowing some graphics from a previous presentation that I made, which was about creating documents, but actually all of these things are still relevant for any kind of exercise that you're going through to create something visual. So I once had a colleague who referred to design as basically just lining things up in a joking fashion. And actually, it's kind of relevant if you think about design, not just about aligning things on your page or on your screen, but also aligning things in a metaphorical sense. So we're trying to align our visual style with all of that messaging that we went through last time trying to talk about. We're aligning any visual metaphors that we're using. If you're using pictures of people or gender-based pictures or pictures of clocks or trees or that kind of thing, just making sure all of those visual metaphors line up with our story. In a physical sense, it's the sort of thing where we need to make sure that we're consistent with things like heading sizes, just so that the user gets, or the user or reader is familiar with how we're structuring our messages. We'll be physically aligning the positions of things on a page, and we'll be aligning the visual styles or graphic elements you use with each other, which is also important so that you're not sort of creating a disconnect between one graphic and another graphic. You're also aligning your color choices with potential meanings of those colors, which we'll talk about. All right, so the first thing I'll go through is a few tips for working with layouts. And as I said, this is kind of a document-based imagery, but it'll work for everything. So sometimes there's a bit of a terror when faced with a blank page. Where do things go? If you're creating something using one of the free tools that we showed you last week, well, you probably start with a template. And one of the reasons they start with templates is to kind of overcome this, so that you've got some things already in position and you just sort of need to replace the content and go from there. But if you're scratch building something, whether it's a chart or a document or a presentation, you're going to start with a blank page. And typically what we do as designers is establish a grid, which is a kind of just a basic structure on a page. And that grid doesn't always look like this. This is just an example grid where we've got 3 columns and a bunch of rows. But it could, for instance, be 2 columns wide or even more, as I'll show you in a second. The key is just to kind of establish one. And what that does is it gives you something to align your images to, your images and your headings and your text and everything, so that you've got kind of a visual anchor point. And what that will do is create a consistency in your layout, and kind of it'll overcome some of those issues with you kind of aligning things and leaving things out of alignment, because you have something to attach it to that makes sense. So what you do is, and this is a really full layout, so perhaps you wouldn't do this here, but you can see that as we've gone, we've got 3 columns, but actually we could run our text in some instances over 2 columns if it made sense. And you can sort of attach things in a modular fashion to that grid. Now, depending on your design tool, the professional design software like the Adobe Creative Suite or some of the other stuff allows you to create a grid of guidelines that the things will kind of snap to make it easy for you. So if you're using something like Microsoft Word or Publisher or PowerPoint, it's not quite so easy. You can pull out some guides from a ruler in those, but even if it's just something that you keep in mind in your head, that you're going to align all of the things in a particular fashion so that you do create that level of consistency. As I said, you'll see if you start looking at, if you've never looked at this stuff before, if you look at newspapers or magazines or any other publication, you'll actually start to see the underlying design grid that someone's used to put that together. And they can be very complicated. This little example here on the left is showing a kind of, I think it's a 7-column grid that I've set up here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 over there. And the problem is that when you start creating additional columns, it becomes slightly more complicated to use because you have more kind of options. And so it can be slightly more difficult to create consistency using that kind of style. The grid is not a kind of must-have. You don't have to attach every single thing to the grid. The idea is you can step outside that if you need to, but then you have to ask yourself, do you need to? Is this object that I'm placing onto my page, does that need to be somewhere different? And if it does, that's totally fine. It's just a kind of basis for you. The other thing about layouts, and I find a lot of people have problems learning to love what I'm going to refer to as open space, but designers sometimes refer to as white space, negative space, or quiet space, which is basically just empty space, in terms of there actually not being anything in that space in your document or your infographic. But actually it does serve a very valuable purpose. And so I find that people have a tendency to try and fill all of the available space, but there's very valuable mileage to be had from leaving some space. So I'll just talk about some reasons why you might want to do that. So if you're building a document or an infographic that's kind of a long and scrolling one, it can be useful to leave some open space to emphasize section breaks. And you can see this left-hand page here is extremely full, very busy, and we get to here and we've got a nice quiet break. We get the idea that we're moving into a new section of information. You can use open space to emphasize certain information. So as you can see, we've got all this layout here, and this space here, even though there's nothing in it, is very important in this layout because it's emphasizing that there. You can use open space to group and to separate information. Once again, this is a quite open layout, but I don't think that you'd say that it's wasted because we've got this clear distinction between these two here. The other thing it's important to do is to allow time for the reader's eye to kind of have a bit of a rest. And it's a little similar, I guess, to this one here where we have that break, and it kind of gives you a momentary pause and allows your eye kind of a little break from all of this busyness over here. So the lesson is that you don't have to fill every space. You can let your space work for you. And it's a really common thing and what you'll find is that when you're reading other people's documents or looking at other people's infographics, that you don't mind the open space in those, but when you're building one for yourself, it can be very difficult because you think, oh, what's that space there? What do I do with that? And sometimes you don't have to do particularly anything with it. It's working for you. All right, alignment. Let's talk about that. So if you're using a document grid, it can be pretty easy to overcome some of these alignment issues that I'll talk about just here in a second. But it's not always possible. So what we find is that if you have an object that's kind of quite close to another object, but without kind of aligning in a sensible fashion with it, it creates a kind of visual stress on the page. And what that does is kind of draw the eye unnecessarily to that point. So let me give you an example here. So we can see that because that text doesn't quite align there, it has this quite interesting sort of stress. And if you're looking at a full layout and there's one thing like this, it's out of alignment, because the eye is very good at recognizing patterns, because this breaks the pattern, your eye will go straight towards it. And that might create a kind of unnecessary emphasis on this piece here. And so it's pretty easy to fix. You can just align it, but actually it's probably a little close to that text. So we just give it a little breathing room. So if you're using columns, what you can find sometimes is that pieces of information between the columns might align in a fashion like this, just by the nature of perhaps this is a picture and another picture, and they kind of have this incidence here. So what you might want to do if it's an image is either crop the bottom or move them apart, depending on whether or not that meets the needs of the grid that you've chosen to design to. So even just doing that, because it's a little further away, I mean, it's kind of a little bigger of an overlap there, so it sort of makes more sense and it's less stressful to the eye. But it would be ideal if there was a little bit of quiet space between them. So typography is kind of the art of using text, if you like, or fonts as they're commonly referred to, although designers would refer to them more as typefaces. The text elements in your document are extremely important. Even your infographics are all going to be in pictures. You're going to have headings, you're going to have captions, you're going to have possibly some small paragraphs of body text. And so it's important to kind of treat your text nicely. Typography as a practice is extremely kind of delicate, and designers go their whole life feeling like they've never really got on top of being really great at using typography. So I'm not going to spend a long time talking about all of the things that you should consider with your text, but I'm just going to give you a few tips here, and then a good resource for choosing fonts. So let's talk about some common sort of things that people do. So please don't stretch your text. If you stretch it sideways or vertically, it can kind of upset the balance in the fonts. And you can see here that when this one's stretched sideways, these little uprights here become thicker than that one there, and it makes it a little bit less balanced. So it's a common error that can arise depending on the software package that you're using. If you're just trying to stretch an image to fill a space, and the text inside that image gets stretched, it's best if you can avoid that. So let's leave the typefaces as they were designed. Building a presentation or even a document or an infographic, it is best to avoid using complicated text effects. There's just sort of no need for those things. Like complicated 3D effects in this kind of static environment can be quite difficult to make kind of look good. So all of these whiz-bang effects and stuff, they don't really add anything to your message. It's more powerful if you just use the text as it is, nicely treated. It's important that you avoid using body text, so text that's going to be in larger kind of slabs, that's too big or too small. Let me show you an example. So this text here, I'm hoping you can actually read it on your screen. It is quite small, and actually as designers we have a tendency, or a reputation if you like, for making things as small as you can get away with. But it is important that if text is going to appear in larger slabs, that you don't have it too big or too small, because it's quite stressful for the reader to get through. So when it's too small like this, it's great for smaller captions and that kind of thing. But if you make your text too small in a document, it's going to be difficult for people to get through. But also, the reverse of that is true. I mean, look at this big paragraph text here, and as you read through this paragraph, I'm hoping you are, you'll find that your eye has to work quite hard. You know, it's moving quite a lot to get from one end of the line to the other. And by the time you get to the end of the paragraph, it can be difficult to remember what's happened in the start, because it takes you quite a bit to get through it. So these kind of things are great for smaller blocks of text, like pull quotes or headings that you want to stand out on the page. But don't try and make big slabs of text really big like this. It won't aid the comprehension. Here's another common, well, I won't say mistake, but something that I see commonly, even in layouts from designers. So justified text, I'm talking about that text that's sort of even on both sides, which is a pretty default kind of setup for a lot of people's documents. And what you can see there is that where words are quite long, you either have to hyphenate them to get them to go over the line, or they kind of stretch out, and that creates what we call these rivers of space through the text. And when you see this en masse, the rivers themselves kind of create these shapes with that space, and it kind of drags your eye in there. So what you're better off doing actually with that is just aligning it left. It'll make it nice and even. And this ragged right edge here isn't actually a problem for the viewer. You just read through it and away you go. Okay, so a resource for fonts. If you're using one of the template designs or the template tools that we showed you last week, they actually have sets of fonts inside those that you're able to choose from. But if you're scratch building something, you might actually be stuck with the kind of default fonts that come with your computer. And that might not be ideal for what your purpose is. So Google Fonts is a pretty great resource. There's hundreds of fonts that are on Google Fonts that are free for you to download and use. And some of them are quite nice. Some of them not so nice, but that's the way of it with fonts. Let's go have a look now, if I can. One more step. All right, so there's hundreds of fonts to choose from, but let me just talk about this for a second. So choosing fonts is quite difficult. Every typeface has its own personality, and the shapes of those particular characters in that font may or may not work particularly well with other fonts. And so choosing fonts that go together is not always the easiest thing to do. Now, if you're choosing fonts, you can use the same typeface depending on the typeface for your whole thing if you like. But sometimes it's best if you can pair the fonts, and two fonts together look quite good if you can choose them correctly. So this link that is on screen right now is a blog post that has quite a few resources for choosing Google font combinations. So I'm going to go and show you one of those. So this is that link there, and there's a number of different tools here.
Hi, Jim. We're not seeing the link yet. Maybe we should wait a second, or if you change something.
You're not seeing the link? Oh, as in the... Okay, you can still see my screen though, right, Lizzie?
No, I can only see you now. I'm afraid we lost you when you said you're just going to look for show us the link.
Sorry about that. Let's try this. That may happen. I apologize. Okay, so this is that link. Can you see that now?
Yep, it's back now.
Okay, so in this blog post, this person's collected a few different tools here that'll help you if you're kind of trying to choose what two typefaces you'd like to put together. This is one of those where there's just some examples of typefaces used in combination. If you hover over any of these, it'll come up with the name. And then by clicking through, this takes us through to the Google Fonts page. And then, so this is a little example of how that's all going to look, and the character set shows you all of the different characters that are in that font. By clicking on here, it takes us through to Google Fonts here, and by clicking on that link, we can download this font to use on our computer. And there are instructions here inside Google Fonts for installing those fonts on your system. Depending on your operating system, it will change. But also, if you're creating something for the web and you're working with a web developer, these fonts, you don't have to necessarily download them to have them show up in websites. There's some code that people can use that has that font then show up on your website. Okay, so I'm just going to put this back into full screen again. Just let me know if you lose this. You got that there?
I can still see it. Yes, thanks.
Great. Okay, color choices. So color theory, it's also similar to the typographic theory in that there's quite a lot of different rules, and people talk about color wheels and analogous and complementary colors that kind of relate to how the colors fit together on a color wheel. And so there's a lot of going through that if you really wanted to get into the kind of dense color theory. So I'm not going to do that today because it's going to take far too long and might leave you more confused. So what I'm going to talk about initially is assessing the kind of metaphorical meaning of your color. And I think that's fairly obvious when I show red on the screen. So some colors have kind of meanings that we associate with them. And that depends on the context that you're using the color in, and also your cultural background. So some of the meanings for these colors change depending on where you're from in the world. And so you kind of need to be aware, once again, of who your audience is before you start choosing the colors. So red obviously can mean danger. It could also mean hot. But it could also mean love, depending on the context. Green, for example, green for go. But green is also fresh. It's about nature. But actually, depending on the context, if it's a really bright green, it could even mean poison. So there's positive and negative connotations depending on the context that you're using that color in. Black's a funny one. I often find clients don't like using black because of some of those connotations, depending obviously on the culture. But actually, black can also mean, it can kind of like indicate expensive or kind of classy or elegance. Blue, I guess being sort of in the kind of science and environment fields, we're often called on to use blue and green. And blue's quite nice. So it could be calm, sincerity, trust, or royalty, or sky, or water. So the thing about colours, and the thing that I find is that people often think of colour as a decoration. So once we've talked about the meanings of the colours, it's apparent that actually colour isn't just a decoration. So we talk about using colour on a page to brighten things up. That's one way to look at colour, but the other thing is that it has a functional aspect, and it's very important for us to consider that. So what you use colour for is to add emphasis to objects and clarity to information by helping to group and separate. It highlights differences, and it helps us to create relationships. So some of the default programs and data visualization sets that you'll come up with will probably have some nice default color schemes in them that help to separate the data that you're visualizing. As in this example, we can kind of clearly see the distinction between all of these colors, and that might be fine, but actually maybe we want to establish some relationships using the color, and maybe we want to have some stuff here that we're denoting is perhaps less important for the viewer to look at. So that's functional color. And I understand that actually that probably doesn't help a lot of you. What color am I going to use? We'll talk about this in a second. Okay, so when you're choosing your colors, and I'm going to show you a pretty nice web resource in a second that's going to show you a whole bunch of different color combinations of various quality together that you can kind of have a look at and scan through and choose one that you like. So what you find with some color schemes, like this one on your screen, and I apologize for showing this color combination to you because it's kind of intentionally painful a little bit to look at. And you kind of notice when you see a pattern like this with these particular colors, and the same sorts of thing happens if you get a very bright red and a very bright green next to each other, is this kind of visual vibration in the spots here between the colors. It kind of makes your eye go a bit funny. Now, the reason for that is contrast. So they are different colors, but their tonal value is very similar, not the same, but similar. Which is to say, if you think about how that color would be if it was gray, that they're quite similar. And so if you end up with a situation like this, an easy fix is just to establish slightly more contrast. So this color here is essentially the same hue, which is to say it's kind of the same type of pale blue / mauve, but it's actually just been pulled back a little bit so that it's a little bit brighter. And so that establishes the darker and the brighter here, and we've lost a little bit of that visual vibration between these colors, and it's a little easier to look at. Okay, so because I'm not going to go into great detail about color theory and choosing colors that match, and I'm aware that this can be difficult, and it's actually difficult for everybody. You know, designers often mull over exactly the type of color they're going to choose to go with something, and it takes quite a while. It's not something that's going to happen just in an instant. You know, you might need to experiment, change your colors around, and see what fits best. This is a very useful tool. I'm just going to go out of full screen again, so I may need to come back and activate my screen sharing again, do I? Or can you still see my screen there, Lizzie?
I'm afraid not, Jim. I can just see you for a minute.
Okay. All right, so color.adobe.com/explore. You can see a whole lot of color combinations here that different people have made. So Adobe inside their software has a kind of a system where you can save the color combinations that you're using. And a lot of them are kind of public. So on here, you can scan through and see the color combinations that people have chosen. And you can see that some of them work better than others. So this one, for example, I mean, I feel like that's quite a nice progression through there. And this one, there's probably not a great deal of tonal difference, say, between these two colors. And so if you use this green and this kind of greeny yellow next to each other on your screen, they're probably going to vibrate. And the same with this one. But by scanning through here, you might find some stuff that perhaps matches the metaphorical content in your graphic or your document, and also kind of plays nicely together. Now, you've got these colors here. You're like, well, okay, well, how do I get these colors? Well, by going into here, maybe it's not in there. Maybe it's this one. And so these values down here are the color values for that color. And so the hex value here is something that will be used if it's a web application, or for instance, if I was to go to Keynote and try and format one of these colors, I could put that hex value in there just by copying and pasting, and it would apply this color in here. And the red, green, and blue values by typing in those numbers through there. Let's try that. 187, 1, 2. Suddenly we have the color. So I think that's a pretty valuable tool if you're not comfortable kind of choosing your own colors. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to choosing the right chart type for your data. And rather than me tell you my opinion about that, what I've done is I've actually gone and got 2 different infographics that other people have made that tackle this topic. So what I'd like you to do, and hopefully, Lizzie, if you can share those links with the folks now, and I'll show you on screen as well, but it might be handy if you can investigate these 2 links for yourself, because for one of them particularly, you'll need to scroll to absorb the whole infographic, and it might be a bit difficult for me to do that at your speed. So this is number 1, and this is number 2. So I'm just going to take you through those again, pop out of full screen, and then I'll need to share my screen again. So this is number 1, and this is, I guess, a promotional infographic that Fusion charts, which is a kind of JavaScript standard for interactive charts, but not something that I think that common folk like perhaps you and I can use. You sort of have to know a bit of coding knowledge to work out how to use this particular chart system. But anyway, they've come up with a promotional infographic that talks to people about the types of data that fit the types of charts. And, you know, I mean, it's quite nice, right? Like there's a bit of space around everything. It talks about common forms of data analysis. So whether your data is comparison, transition over time, or whether you're comparing the composition of the data. It has some tips for using column and bar charts. And this one, I think, particularly relates to how theirs work, their Fusion chart system. Some tips for using line diagrams and whether or not you might want to use an area diagram. Tips for pie charts, for example, if you've got a lot of values in your pie chart, it's probably best if you can sum them up so that you're not confusing your reader with a whole lot of very small wedges in your pie chart, etc. So that's number 1. And what I'd like you to do when I look at number 2 here is consider which of the 2 infographics do you think is the better infographic, and why. There's no right or wrong answer to that. There's not really like a definitive methodology for saying which one works best, but I just like to foster a discussion about it if we can. So this is number 2, which on the Extreme Presentation blog. And if you kind of go looking for information about how to choose charts, this particular diagram is referenced quite a lot, and here's a zoomed in version of it. Now you can see that it doesn't use color really at all, and it's much more simple in its graphical execution, but obviously it's set up in a very different fashion. This is the decision tree that asks you questions about your data and then suggests a chart type that you might like to use to visualize that data. And I actually think this will be a particularly useful tool for people, but in terms of the discussion, I'm wondering what people think about which one they think is the best. So maybe I'll give you a couple of minutes to click through and explore those 2 infographics. So we'll be referring to example 1 as the Fusion Charts promotional infographic, and the Extreme Presentation chart suggestion thought starter is what we'll refer to as number 2. So has anybody got any thoughts about what they think is a better infographic there? Number 1 or number 2? I'll just take it off screen share for a second. So I'm hoping you guys can see that Lizzie's attached those 2 links, for example 1 and example 2 there in the chat window.
Maybe everyone's checking them now. I can't see any answers just yet. From my point of view, I initially really liked the first one because of the colours and pictures, and I thought the second one was possibly easier to use afterwards. So maybe a hybrid option would be my third one.
And honestly, that's my. I mean, am I muted? Can I talk? No. That's kind of my opinion based on that as well, and that's pretty much the process that I went through. And I see that we've got a couple of answers here. So I think there's a couple of reasons for that, and I'd like to kind of refer back, if we can, to the previous webinar on this topic where I spoke about audience and delivery medium choice. So, I mean, personally, I think that example number 2, I'll just screen share so that we can be on the same page as I chat. And it seems like Bob and Lisa are fairly in agreement on that one. But I want to talk about the choice of audience and the choice of delivery medium. So this infographic, in my opinion, is probably aimed at people who are kind of less familiar with data usage and data visualization tools, which is a sort of interesting choice for Fusion charts, since they're a kind of a JavaScript library that people can use to make charts. And I think that its usage of space around objects, its usage of color is quite nice, and it's very nicely designed. But in terms of, I guess, the kind of audience that we've got here today, I wouldn't be surprised if most people agreed that this one is kind of more practical in some ways, in that because of the setup of the thing, it takes you through this decision tree and you arrive at this here. But if you're not particularly familiar with these chart types, if you've not spent a long time looking at this kind of radial area diagram chart, you might not actually understand exactly what this is talking about. And I think that that's the kind of audience that this particular infographic is aimed at. And that maybe the kind of layperson might actually appreciate the kind of background information in this chart. And the other thing that this one doesn't give us necessarily is some of the kind of caveats about using particular diagrams. So, for example, with pie charts, like the other infographic, the Fusion Charts infographic, number 1, talks about trying to minimize the number of slices that you're showing in your pie chart, because if you have, say, 10 or 15 slices here, some of those are going to end up looking quite similar. They might actually be, one might be twice as much as the other one, but because they're tiny sort of narrow slivers in and of themselves, it can be difficult to compare between them. And so this graphic doesn't really give us some of those tips, whereas this one does. And that's kind of what I'm thinking. That's the audience choice that they've made that's really influenced how this has come about. Okay, well, I might move on, if that's okay with everybody. Okay, so there are actually a lot of other charts types that you can use, and a lot of kind of modern visualization methodologies like chord diagrams and this type of tree diagram, which is a really beautiful tree diagram put together by a quite well-known information journalist called William McCandless, who did a wonderful TED talk actually on this topic. And if you follow those links there, perhaps in your own time, you'll see that this particular diagram and the way it shows the proportions is quite dramatic and quite powerful. But this particular chart type is not covered in either of those 2 infographics we looked at, because it's a little bit kind of left field. But there are quite a few, so just have a look around and see what other people have done with your type of data. So what I thought I'd do actually is give you a little kind of background information about an infographic that I worked on with Michelle, who's one of the other webinar hosts for Future Earth. So I just thought I'd give you some insight into how this infographic came about, the decisions that we made, and give you some kind of work in progress shots along the way, so you can see how we kind of, didn't necessarily arrive at our final iteration immediately. So let's go through that. So the infographic was concerning the complexity of governance issues in particular landscape in Peru. So the brief to me initially was to create a graphic or series of graphics that was supposed to support a blog piece, which was talking about the findings of a quite dense governance sort of jurisdictional report about this landscape in Peru. So the first thing that we did is we sat down and we had a big, long conversation about it. As a designer, it's really important for me to kind of understand the actual story. And I think if you're a communications, if you're working in science communications, but you're not sort of actually the person who's collecting the data, and you're working with those types of practitioners to visualize their data, it's really important, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but I just want to point it out, to really get to understand it, or understand where the scientist is coming from, and what they feel the findings are, what they feel the important parts are. So these were the raw inputs. This is the stuff that they gave to me. They had a PowerPoint presentation which had some examples, and this is a kind of geographical representation of a few different land use types in an area. And then look at these arrows showing different areas of the government have different responsibilities over that area. So in conversation with Michelle and Ashwin, the scientists who we were working with to create this visualization, it became apparent that actually the situation was quite a bit more complex than even this complex diagram said. And so in the report, there's a bunch of tables that kind of indicate a function and the different arms of government at different levels who have jurisdiction over that function. And it became obvious that actually the situation is quite intertwined. And so actually what we decided to do was to work at we didn't really want to oversimplify it. We really wanted to show that this was a complex issue, and this particular landscape had quite a bit going on. And that was the story that we wanted to focus on. And it wasn't necessarily actually about people kind of seeing which land use type was associated with which arm of government at what level necessarily. It was more about the fact of showing how it was intertwined. And so this is my initial process sketch. So how I like to work with these things is actually just sketch things out on pen and paper and throw a lot of scraps in the bin. But this was the first one that I sent back to the folks I was working with as a kind of thought starter. And so we have a geographical representation, and we had some kind of signs popping out of the different areas there showing us what was going on in that particular landscape, that particular land use type. And so they kind of, generally liked it, and so I kind of colored it up and gave a little bit more of an example of what these little flags would look like when they popped out. And we progressed it even further to a digital application. And this is my first iteration, which admittedly is ridiculous. This text here is very difficult to read. So we worked on it again, and we came up with a kind of table implementation, which we still didn't think was particularly good. The information's there and you can consume it, but it doesn't really tell the story properly. And look, so where we arrived was at this long form infographic initially, where the landscape is shown here at the top in a kind of isometric drawing, much as we had previously, and the different land uses are projected up the top here with these little flags that have a color. And what we see here is that these overlap. And then underneath that, we have a network diagram here, which is, I will admit, quite confusing upon first glance. But as I said earlier, actually the complexity is the story in this case. And what you'll find from looking at this diagram a little bit is that it starts to make sense. So we have line thicknesses that indicate the level of government. We have the government department here, and the function or area of responsibility as we've titled it here. And you can see that, for example, for the brown area, which is mining, the Department of Energy and Mining here is responsible at the regional and national level for authorization, but local authorities, or kind of regional authorities, you know, the very small, very lower level here, are also responsible. So there's this kind of conflict here between these three. How do you arrange something in that space, and so on through the diagram? And so that was our initial iteration of this diagram. We wanted to do something that was long form like this, that people could kind of spend some time with scanning backwards and forwards, but was asked also to work with a web developer to make an interactive conversion of it. And I'm hoping it's still up at this side, actually. Let's have a look. Yes. We have an interactive version of it, which I'll probably need to show you by turning my screen sharing back on. So here's the same diagram as it ended up in the interactive iteration of it. There's a couple of switches here. It ended up being translated into Spanish. And you can switch it to vertical or horizontal depending on your device, which way is easier for you to view it. So for me, so by hovering over a particular land use area, we can see that it highlights in the network diagram over there what's going on for that particular land use type. And by spending some time kind of looking around here, all right, so let's say we're interested in seeing what the Department of Agriculture does. Well, we can see that it has all of these different responsibilities at a couple of different levels and so on. And also we can refer back to our geographical diagram here. Regional Environmental Authority is responsible for protected areas and REDD+ projects. So that was how we arrived at this particular iteration. Let's take off the screen sharing. So I'm not necessarily saying that this is the best example of, you know, of the best iteration of this particular information. That's the solution that we arrived at to show the story that we wanted to show. And perhaps if you were faced with the same complicated information, you'd come up with a different solution. So that's where we got to, and that's the kind of process that we went through. So you can see that. Sorry, Lizzie, you're gonna.
Out of interest, Jim, how long did you spend making those infographics?
In terms of the amount of actual time for me to do that, it wasn't so long in terms of actually sitting down with a pen and paper. But you can imagine that this projects have quite a long tail, and so the initial ideation process that we went through was reasonably fast. Maybe over the course of a few weeks, kind of backwards and forwards, work on a little bit, send some stuff, have a discussion, change some other stuff around. But then by the time we actually got through to the implementation phase of that, getting it into that interactive stage, and then of course you have things like trying to work out whether or not our wording is capturing exactly the data, because some of those tables that we looked at, we actually kind of collapsed those categories down a little bit. So even though it's complex, it's actually not as complex as the situation on the ground, because we sort of group some of them together, but I think we're still telling the same story. So I think overall it took us about 3 months to get it from start to finish. But that wasn't 3 months of my full-time work as a designer at all.
Ah, that's useful to know, interesting. We've got about 10-15 minutes left of the webinar, so just wanted to say if other people want to ask questions, please start putting them in the chat box as we're going along.
Great. Well, I don't have too much more left to talk about, I don't think. No, I've sort of arrived at the end here. I just want to say thank you for joining for the previous webinar and for this one. It's been great. And I also thought I would show you, if you still need some more inspiration and you still want to look for some additional additional pieces. I have to share my screen, don't I? So thank you. If you still need some more inspiration, I've got a few links here for some stuff that I tend to kind of look at in my research phase, so which I said is the kind of the first step. And I tend to keep an eye on these things on a kind of daily or weekly basis, even kind of looking through and seeing what people have come up with lately. So let's go, and hopefully it doesn't lose the screen sharing. Let's kind of have a look at the first one here. So this is Visually. Visually is kind of a service that people can use. They're a business that make infographics, basically. They're kind of an intermediary between people who wish to have infographics made and designers. And so if you're a designer, you can sign up, and if you want something made, you can use them as a service to get that to happen. But anyway, they have this kind of gallery here of infographics that people have made of varying quality that you can look through and investigate, see if there's anything that meets your needs. Informationisbeautiful.net is William McCandless's own site, and there's a lot of really wonderful data visualizations and infographics on this website. And I think this is a great thought starter to go through here and see how people have tackled particular problems. But one resource that I use quite frequently is actually Pinterest. If you haven't seen Pinterest before, I think you actually need to register an account, which is a little bit annoying, but people share. There's a lot of, I guess, link sharing sites and portals out there. Reddit is another one. Pinterest is great for this particular purpose because it's such a visual medium of sharing. And so I've just gone here into the search box and typed in sustainability infographic. And as people share things on this site, they tag them. And this kind of shows all of the things that are tagged with those two keywords. And so you can kind of scan through and see how other people have tackled things. And searching for different things yields different results. So I hope you find some of this stuff useful. It kind of brings me to the conclusion of my kind of talking to the screen part of this presentation. I'm hoping that you guys have some questions that you're happy to share with us. If you get through this and you've got something you're working on and you'd like some feedback on it, we're still accepting some submissions from attendees, so just send you through your graphics to that email address, and the first few through will be able to provide some personalized feedback on. But keep going. Future Earth are kind of happy to, if Lizzie, you're happy to jump in here, but happy to look at possibly sharing on some of this content through their blog or their site as well. So please submit your stuff to that. And if you missed some of the earlier ones, that's the link again for that. And I'll come back now and take my screen off sharing.
Thanks, Jim. I'm just waiting to see if anyone's got any questions. I think people are so blown away by all the information that they're still picking it in. To reiterate what you said about the blog, I don't know if anyone in the audience was also in the blog webinars, but we invited people to submit articles for the blog, which we'd review and potentially publish on the blog. In the same way, if you have an infographic that you think would work for the Future Earth blog, if it's about global environmental change, please don't hesitate to get in touch with at the Gmail address Jim just showed, and we'll get back to you about whether we can make use of it on the blog. So there's a few questions starting now, if you're ready, Jim.
Great.
Baron Wilshut, sorry if I've pronounced that wrongly. Are there any specific infographic designers you admire, Jim, and why?
Well, definitely William McCandless, who I was just referring to here for Information is Beautiful. He's really quite famous for quite startling and kind of wow moment visualizations and infographics. So he's definitely worth looking at. Kind of the godfather of, I guess, the kind of modern infographic movement is a guy called Edward Tufte. I think I'm pronouncing his surname correctly. So I'm just going to type these in the chat bar and hope they come up. And Edward Tufte has some really great practical advice for people wishing to create information and presenting information, how to escape what he calls flatland, which I think is probably getting to Charlotte's question there about illustrating change in a geographical sense. Um, there's many more. In fact, let me talk about one more. I'm just going to see if I can get their website up so that I can paste it in for you. Excuse me for a second. There is an infographic or kind of data visualization. Mostly they make interactive visualizations. Team called Periscopic. I'm just going to get a link up to one of my favorite of their visualizations. So we probably don't have time to go through this one. This particular infographic is extremely wonderful, extremely powerful, and without being political at all, it's about kind of visualizes gun deaths in the United States. There's one for 2010 and one for 2013. And the way that the visual metaphor that they've chosen to use with that is something called stolen years, where they've taken data for gun deaths and the data for life expectancy and kind of merge the two, so that you, and the way they've done that is to kind of say, like, if the person who was killed by a gun here, there's a possibility based on statistical distribution that they might have lived to there. So I'm going to just put that link in the chat box here. So in your own time, please feel free to have a look at that and take what you will from it. But personally, I think it's an extremely powerful usage of data visualization to tell a very powerful story. Move on to Charlotte's question. Any ideas how we can illustrate change combined with geographical distribution? For example, levels of poverty and in a map rather than a bar chart. Well, let me think about that. So in terms of the tools that we've shown you so far, I think infogram might be a useful one to show there. Ideally for that particular purpose, it'd be great to have something interactive, right? So that you can see the distribution change as you click through it. If not, it can be great to show things in what Edward Tufte refers to as small multiples. So kind of iterations of the same thing with the data changing over the top in the visual sense, so you can see how that works. Another great example of specifically levels of poverty change is, and I'm sure lots of people are familiar with a guy called Hans Rosling, who has some really wonderful videos actually showing poverty and how that changes in a geographical sense over time using an animated bubble chart. So it's not actually over a map. Let me see if I can dig up that link for you as well. For 1 second. And Hans Rosling is also quite a well-renowned data specialist, and he has some really quite amazing talks. I won't show you a video in here, but I don't actually have that link, but I'll send you to his website. Might be helpful. You can see how he's tackled a similar geographical distribution problem. So Gapminder is Hans Rosling. Go and have a look at his work. It's also quite powerful and really quite wonderful. Okay. So the questions that we have here, Lizzie.
Can you share your Pinterest account with everyone, please, Jim?
Sure. How do I even do that? There's a lot of design inspiration stuff that I share with my board, but I'm not actually sure how to tell you how to find me, to be honest with you. That's me, Jeremiah James II. Perhaps you can look me up like that. Oh, you can't see my screen, can you?
Yeah, but,
let me just see if I
try and find it.
Let's see if I've got this link. Okay, great. I think I have it.
Great. While that's loading up, just to say we've gone for exactly an hour now. So if anyone has any final questions, get them in the chat box now to put to Jim, and then we'll be finishing up in a few minutes.
Great, thanks for having me. That's a really good comment actually there from Ursula. The Tableau is quite good for maps as well. And also, what was the other tool we showed last week? Watson Analytics also works quite well with maps.
Great. So just to confirm again, for anyone who missed last week's webinar, the video is on our website on the blog with the other pop-up webinar videos. It's also on our YouTube channel, and the slides are on our website and on SlideShare. This webinar will be going to the same place. Please keep in touch using the Gmail address Jim showed earlier. And you can also contact us using Twitter, either Future Earth Twitter or directly to Jim using the hashtag #PopUpWebinars.
Great. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks very much, everyone, and see you next time.